So I'd like to talk about the playing surface here for a while, the map that we're going to play the game on. If you'll notice in the bottom, there is a scale of miles, 20 miles, which on the scale, which makes the map about 60 miles in height and about 80 miles in width. So that allows not only just the historical Waterloo campaign, but also other alternative strategies that our player as Napoleon might use. There are a couple of things that will give the game its shape, to give the campaign its shape. One are the supply sources. In the west for Wellington's army, where Ghent goes toward the sea, and for the Prussian army it'll be in the northeast, for Napoleon's army in the south, and those supply sources have to be guarded. Not so much in this game because of the lack of supply, because it's only a 2-week campaign, but if an army loses its access to supply, it would suffer a morale disadvantage. It would suffer a morale deficit. So that is definitely built into the game. If the opposing army cuts into the supply line, the army that's affected has a supply and morale deficit. The other thing that gives shape to the game is the victory conditions. Now, I'm a real enemy of point system just because it's so gamey. So what really is giving this, the victory conditions for this game are just the surviving of the armies. Now, historically, an army disintegrated when it lost about 1/3 of its men. So that's what each army is trying to do, is survive by making the other armies lose 1/3 of their men. Certainly, if the French army knocks the other two armies out, it wins the game. Makes them lose more than 1/3 of their strength. But however, since it's a 3-player game, if the Prussians and the Anglo-Allied army cause Napoleon to lose 1/3 of his strength, the army that wins is the one that loses the least of their own men, which is the kind of the political component that makes part of the interest of this game. That is, Blucher with the Prussians wants to beat Napoleon, but he also wants to make sure that he loses less Prussian soldiers than Wellington loses of British and Anglo-Allied soldiers, and vice versa. And this was something that came in the campaign, was they were, let's let the other guys suffer and keep our men alive. At the same time, we're defeating Napoleon. So it's strictly on that basis that the winner of the game is decided. Now, there is an important city, and that is Brussels. That's the focus of the campaign. The reason is this, that if the Allies lost Brussels, about 1/3 of Wellington's army would desert. That is, all the Netherlands and the Belgian soldiers who had pretty recently actually been part of the French army would leave the British army. So Wellington especially needs to make sure that Brussels is not captured. And that gives shape to the campaign too. We've talked about morale, which is a very important consideration for each of the 3 armies. Now let's talk about the terrain a little bit. On the map we have these terrain parts that have effects. First of all, the roads. There are 3 kinds of roads. The main roads, which are kind of reinforced with a rust collar, they were called chaussées, the highways. And I consulted about 6 different period maps to distinguish between the main roads, that is the highways, and the average roads and the very poor roads. So the average roads are shown in just a black line. The poor roads are shown in a dotted line. And there's different movement rates for each of those 3 kinds of roads. So an army that wants to move fast will try to move along the highways. An army that has to move along the poor roads will move slowly. And since speed is is a main consideration. That's something that each army has to keep in mind. Rivers, crossings, always a major part of every game or every campaign. So the bridges and the rivers are important. You've got the Sambre flowing along the bottom of the map, and other streams mainly flowing in other parts of the map. The heavy woods and the light woods affect the combat, where if combat occurs in the heavy woods, for example, artillery and cavalry are disadvantaged. Towns give strength to the defenders which is what historically armies did, was kind of fight in the towns to give their defense a little help. High ground is shown by the brown. There's high ground here that also advantages the defenders. And there are also crests that affect artillery fire and occur every so often on the map. So those things I wanted to show you from the map before I showed you how the game actually works and before we see armies moving over the map.